Hello. It's been a week or maybe more since I've done a Facebook Live video. I've been traveling. I was in Minnesota for a week, seeing some friends, hanging out, doing an event there, one of my building on fire events. And so I was planning on doing a Facebook Live when I was there with my friend Jay, but it never happened. We were just having too much fun. So sorry about that. And then you kind of get out of the way of things. But I'm back. I've got my morning coffee. It's another roasting day in LA. It's Friday, so I don't know how many of you are going to be able to actually watch this live. I'm sure lots of you have real jobs and are not wasters like me. But there's definitely a few people have clicked in. We've got about 30 people. This morning I thought I would, as I usually do, give a few thoughts on some topic and then have a chance to hear from you, and it'll all take around 30 minutes. If that's fine, feel free, write your comments, your questions, your thoughts, just say hi. Oh, there's Dean from South Africa. Wow, there's people from all over. Jeff says hi. Yeah, Gabrielle says real office jobs. Yes. I know it's not morning everywhere in the world, but if you're in America, you're likely in some office somewhere. So today I thought I would talk about God, which, I know I'm kind of a philosopher and a theologian, and I spend my life talking about these issues, but you may notice that I don't talk about God very much. In fact, the kind of theology that I explore is very much interested in what you can't say about God, and it's very about embracing the material world, etc., etc. But I thought I would do at least one Facebook Live, maybe actually do a series of Facebook Lives on the question of God. And the way that I phrased the title of this, you'll notice it's what goes on in the name of God, which is something that John Caputo has said in some of his books, like The Weakness of God, is, instead of saying, what is God or who is God, a question we can ask is, what gets done in that name? What is housed in that name? What is happening to those who use that name, who feel that they are caught up in something that they use that name for? So what gets done in the name of God? And I want to use something from the psychoanalyst Lacan to try to clarify this. So it's going to be a bit of an academic one this morning. Get your coffees and buckle up, or go away and watch something more fun like kitten videos or something like that. But for a bit of theory, you're in the right spot. Lacan famously said that we as human beings are caught up in three simultaneous realities, three registers that make up our experience of ourselves as a subject. Now, this is similar to what Freud said. Most of you will know there's the id, the ego, and the superego is a way that Freud thought about the human subject. The id is this bubbling place of desire. The ego is broadly our sense of self, who we are. It's our kind of idealized Facebook version of ourselves that we carry around. And our superego is kind of this authority voice that is within us, that kind of tells us what we should and shouldn't be doing. That's a terrible description, but I'm just using it as a background, the id, the ego, and the superego. Well, Lacan had a similar kind of framework, and he called it the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And I'm just going to do an overview of this. I think you'll find this interesting, actually, regardless of what I'm going to do with it theologically. You'll probably resonate with some of it, because these registers are there all the time in our lives. When we fall in love, when we hang out with our friends, when we're on our own, these three registers are operating. So the first is the imaginary. And the imaginary is basically, think of the term image. It comes from the idea of the image. And in a previous Facebook Live, I talked about how, using Adam Phillips, we all lead double lives. We all lead at least double lives. The lives we live and our unlived lives. And I talked about how our first experience of this happens when we are frustrated in our youth. Literally, for some of us, whenever we are not close to our mother, when we're not close to our mother's breast, it's the first time potentially that we feel dissatisfied and going, crap, I'm hungry and I'm cold and what's going on, right? That is a very early experience of creating a separation between what you have and what you would like to have, right? Very early on, there's what you have or don't have and what you would like to have. And as we grow up, these continue to exist. So we have worlds that we live in and worlds that we would like to live in. So maybe you are in an office job at the moment and you dream of, winning the lottery and living in Barbados. I don't know what your dream is, but we as human beings live between these worlds. We don't live in the lived world. We don't live in the unlived world. In a sense, we live in the space between these. So if you want to know more about that, check out my last or a couple of Facebook lives ago, I talked about it. But something else happens when we're really young that I don't think I did mention. And it's the point when you look in a mirror, symbolically or literally, and you begin to see somebody who has their life together. So basically, as an infant, you're a bit crap, to be honest, right? You're falling over all the time, you're crying, you have these experiences in your body, like explosions that you don't even have names for, like hunger, pain, fear, this chaos of existence. And there's a point when someone says, you're brave, you're strong, you're smart, look at you, you can stand up, look at you, you can walk across the room, wow. And maybe you're held in front of a mirror, look at you, look how amazing you are. And this is great, right? But what happens at this point is at a very, very subtle level, we begin to construct an image of ourselves that doesn't quite match our internal reality. So we begin to construct something that exists between who we are and who we would like to be. And just like we have the lived life and the unlived life, and we live somewhere in the middle of that, there is who we are and who we would like to be. And we live somewhere in the middle of that. As we grow, we continue to have these images of ourselves. If you think about it, I'm always scruffy, so this doesn't happen too often. But if you look good one night, you go out, you've got makeup on, or you're well dressed, and all of that, and you catch yourself in the mirror. You can often be fascinated by that. There's a sense of literally looking in a mirror or looking in a car window when you're walking past, when you're looking good. And people think, oh, this it's pure narcissism. You're just interested in your own image, and in a sense you are, but often because your own internal experience is different from the person you see in the mirror. So maybe you're on a date and you go to the bathroom, and you look in the mirror, and you're feeling inside anxiety. You're feeling like, is this going well? Am I presenting myself well? There's fears and there's chaos inside. But you look in the mirror and what do you see? Well, you see someone who looks beautiful or looks well made up or looks like they've got it all together. And you kind of go, that's me. This is great. This is working. This is okay. And seeing the mirror image kind of helps you deal with the chaos. So you might be on your way to a party, and again, your social anxiety, you just wish you'd stayed in and watched TV, you're nervous that no one will talk to you, all of this stuff. But you look at yourself in the mirror, and if you're looking good and you've really put an effort in or whatever, that can make you go, well, I'm presenting myself as someone who is sociable, who is fun, who has it together. And so you see how we kind of live in this middle space between the image and the self. Now, in love, the imaginary plays a role. Now, it's dangerous when it plays too big a role. In the imaginary, this is where we fall in love with people who are basically flattering images of ourselves. We're really attracted to people who think like us, who act like us, who reflect something of who we think we are, like in a really good way. And so in a relationship, you might end up having arguments because you disagree on something politically, and it gets really chaotic. Now, that's kind of at the level of the imaginary in a little bit, because often we want the other who we love to reflect back our views on ourselves. and kind of tell us that our views are right. We may have doubts or deep down on our unconscious about our political or religious views, but when the person we love says that they believe it, it kind of helps us feel more confident. It kind of allays some of the anxiety. Of course, the problem is if our love is very much based on the imaginary, then our love is very much based on our idealized image of ourselves, and we don't really connect with the other. We make them into a type of fantasy object, a flattering version of ourselves. So that's something that we see in daily life. When we hang out when we make friends with people, we're often make friends with those people who agree with us. We're at a party and, you know, I mention, oh, I really hate such and such a TV program. And the person beside me says, oh, God, so do I. And I'm like, you seriously? And then you talk and you realize that you agree on lots of things and you get really excited. And that's totally fine. But, you know, in many respects, this is about you kind of meeting a version of yourself. And then it gets awkward if suddenly you kind of like disagree on something and you kind of brush over that, right? That's part of life. Then there is the symbolic. The symbolic describes something that grounds the imaginary, something that's a little bit harder to conceptualize. The symbolic is basically the frame within which you look at the world. And the frame that helps you judge who is pure and who is impure, who is a terrorist, who is a freedom fighter, who is good and who is bad. The symbolic is the frame that you use to look at everything in the world. You're kind of like going about things, you see things in a certain way. The symbolic is what frames that, and you're often not aware of it. You just know what's yuck and what's good. You just know who's right and who's wrong, what political party is good and what political party is bad. That is this symbolic structure that grounds you and grounds your world of meaning, is a guarantee that your world is meaningful. And it doesn't just frame your world, it colors your world, like wearing glasses that you see the world through. Now, in relationships, sometimes we fall in love with people who are symbolic figures for us. You'll notice people who are married often, who have kids, often refer to their partner as their mummy or their daddy. Now, of course, that's sometimes because their kid is there. Oh, what does mummy want? What does daddy want? But then you'll also see it often the kid isn't even around and they'll talk about mummy and daddy. Or a child puts their hand up in school and says mummy instead of, you know, Mrs. Hamilton or whatever it is, right? These are sometimes where you see the symbolic just leak out. That we often are attracted to people who are stand-ins for our symbolic world. They're kind of like reflections of authority figures from our past that have helped us shape and see the world. And again, this isn't bad or good in and of itself. It's not healthy if that's the only reason why you're going out with somebody, is because you're making them into a mother or a father for you. You know, sometimes you'll see an example would be, you know, someone who's obsessive. Often they're sexually attracted to people until they really get close to the person, and then the other becomes a mother figure. So their desire gets lost. I don't know. Well, that's true of a lot of obsessives. Is they can only be attracted to the other who is reducible to an object. As soon as they get close to the subjectivity of the other, they lose their sexual desire. And of course, that's a problem if you're obsessive, because you want to love and desire at the same time. That's actually a real problem for many people, is that love and desire don't often mesh. You can love someone and desire someone, but strangely, when you start loving the person you desire, then the desire goes. Or if you start desiring the one you love, the love goes, right? These are human problems. But what I was saying probably isn't correct about the obsessive, that they turn someone into their mother. But often in relationships, like mafia bosses, you can say, the stereotypical example is, they go out and sleep with prostitutes, but they go like, I'd never treat my wife like that. Those are the lips that she kisses my son with. In other words, the wife becomes a type of mother figure and this happens as well. Alternatively, somebody might want to go out with someone much older who's like a father figure to them, etc., etc. So this is the symbolic. And again, it's not all bad, but it's bad if your relationships are purely on the symbolic realm. And then the most interesting of the three is the real. And the real is also the most difficult to understand. But at a simple level, the real is that which enters our world, which disrupts the symbolic and disrupts the imaginary. The real is that which blows everything up, right? It breaks the frame, breaks the glasses that we're wearing, disrupts who we think is good and who we think is bad, who we think is a terrorist and who we think is, the person who's allowed to kill. These, whatever, the who's right, the who's wrong, the systems that we have in place. The real is that which disturbs that. Doesn't necessarily break it down completely, but it disturbs, it relativizes, it makes us have to think, oh, maybe these are historical ideas and I have to think critically about them. So the real enters our world at different times. It might be very simply, you think having money, a job and a relationship, is the best. And if you don't have a relationship, it's probably because you're sad. And if you don't have a job, it's because you're lazy. If you don't have savings, it's because, you're not able to take discipline and responsibility for your life, right? There's your frame. You just think it. But then you lose your job, there's a recession, the bank takes your house back, you lose your partner through all of the stress of what's going on. This can be an invasion of the real, because now you're going, oh, just having a job doesn't mean that, not having a job doesn't mean you're lazy. You can not have a job because things have gone really badly. Not through any fault of your own. And sometimes you can be single because, if your relationship wasn't successful, it's not because you didn't try hard enough. You realize, oh my goodness, sometimes life gets in the way, etc., etc. And it kind of ruptures your whole world of meaning. And sometimes we just replace one structure with another. So that's these three things. The imaginary, which is idealized, flattering images of ourselves that we put onto other people that reflect us. The symbolic, the underlying structure by which we understand the world, the frame. And the real, that which erupts and breaks into that, causes us to rethink the very coordinates of our existence. Oh, and by the way, I mentioned love in the other two. What does love in the real mean? That's the most crazy type of love. That's the most kind of fun type of love and destructive type of love. That creates Bonnie and Clyde and Abelard and Eloise and whatever. It's the type of love where you break family traditions. You cross religious and political boundaries. Where, like in Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants marry during the Troubles. Whenever that was a death sentence, you had to leave. If you were in certain areas, you have to leave the country. That just ruptures everything you think you know, and is very intoxicating, and whatever. And love at its best has all three elements of those built, hard baked into it. What does this mean in relation to theology, God, or whatever? Well, at a basic level, when we use the word God, we often unknowingly create a bigger, better version of ourselves, a flattering version of ourselves. This is like in folk religion, where God is just like, in the same way in LA, you can tell what people are like by looking at their dogs. Right? Is it a small, cute dog? Is it a big, butch dog? Is it kind of well-groomed? Is it shaggy? Your dog tells you about the personality of the person who owns the dog in many ways. So people's gods tell you about their own values, their own ideas of themselves, etc., etc. This is what was beautifully critiqued in the 19th century by Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. When you read them, they are the ones who basically say so much religion, so much of what goes on in that name is projection. It's just basically a flattering image of the community itself, writ large. Right? And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. That's why even very conservative theologians like Karl Barth really loved Feuerbach, because he felt that he basically critiqued liberal theology, said liberal theology is just projection, it's at the level of the imaginary. But of course, fundamentalist theology you can think of as well as operating at the level of the imaginary. Then there is, of course, the symbolic. So theologically, what does that look like? Well, that's more like philosophical theology or analytic philosophy. You see this idea that God is what guarantees meaning. God is I think it was I can't remember. I think it was Descartes talked about God as the guarantor of meaning. Well, Descartes definitely did talk like that. I don't know if he was the primary person, but God is the guarantor of a meaningful universe that operates in a certain way. And whenever God is taken in a symbolic sense, at its most crude, that means, God blesses our tanks and our army, and blesses us. We're the ones who are right. The way we look at the world is correct, and God is the justification for the fact that there is a meaningful universe, and that we can participate in that meaning, and that our side is ultimately right. Although you can think of symbolic systems where you'd be more self-critical, but ultimately, if we think of God and religion as that which guarantees our way of life, our protection, our values, then that is God operating and being thought of primarily in the symbolic, regime. Now, a lot of religion happens in those spaces, and a lot of religion can seem to be mostly at the symbolic or mostly at the imaginary. But within, I think, probably all religions, but I'm going to talk about Judaism a little bit and maybe Christianity, because that's the tradition. Those are the traditions I know more about. There is this idea that God is not projection, but what Caputo says is a projectile. God is not projection, but a projectile. In other words, the name God is also used to describe the event in which we are ruptured. Our ideas of what is right and what is wrong, who is good and who is bad, are broken open to new possibilities. Our worlds are destabilized. The reified kind of worlds that we have are melted, become molten, so that they can flow in new directions. So you see this obviously with the unnameable name of God in Exodus. You cannot name me. I am that I am. You can't even say the name God. You see this with God, who comes in and is kind of like throwing our human understandings, to the wind. This in theology is probably called, it's the dialectic tradition, dialectical theology. In theology, again, it's quite conservative in some elements, but Karl Barth, the Karl Barth that I like, which is the early Barth, he says that when God enters the world, God comes in as that which blows up our views of what religion is and what good and bad is. God is a no to our yes. That's the dialectic, the opposite. We create our regimes, and something comes in and smashes those regimes. And Barth in his early days is expressing this idea that all our religious and political ideologies are relativized and problematized by the name of God, the event of God. So I don't know how long I've been on, because Facebook have changed their thing and it's not telling me, but I'm guessing I've been rabbiting on for a good 20 minutes. So we'll just sum up and have a look, see if you've made any comments or questions. That when we use the word God, I think that we simultaneously use all three of those. So there is a sense in which, of course, if I use the word God, it will reflect something of my own self, my own being, at its best. As Feuerbach would say, we take our fragmented, problematic selves, and there's something about idealizing certain elements of that. So the word God becomes sometimes a way of saying something about my ideals and my values. Also, the word God reflects something of an authority that grounds my world, that I tend to, if I use the word God, But it might not be God. It might be, you know, ideology, politics, whatever, culture, you know, the absolute, whatever you want to call it. But without thinking, there is this underlying structure, the way I look at the world. And if I use the word God, God is often used in that way. However, within the, you know, the Christian tradition that I'm part of and other traditions as well, there is this sense in which God has to also be understood as the real. And the real is that which ruptures the symbolic and the imaginary, breaks us open to new possibilities, shows that our way of looking at the world isn't divinely justified, but is created in history and can cause oppressions and violence. So this is why, and we may explore this in the future Facebook Live, you can say God is always in the oppressed other, because the oppressed other, if we listen to them, is the one who ruptures our systems of right and wrong. We live in a just system. We live in a system where good triumphs over evil, where if you're innocent, you'll be treated well. You know, if you're guilty, then you've got something to fear from the authorities. That's completely sensible. And then you encounter the other who's oppressed by your system, and you're like, oh, shit, that's not true. It's not true that if you're innocent, you're going to be treated well. If you're guilty, you'll be treated badly. There's a system where actually you can be innocent and be shot. You know, there's a system where you can be innocent and put in prison. There are people who have done nothing wrong and are harassed. And so the other is the real. The other exposes to you something maybe in your system that you were blind to, that that you participate in. And in many ways, I want to say that that is the primary purpose of the name God at its best. Of course, it will have imaginary elements. Of course, it will have symbolic elements. But what we really need to concentrate on in these tumultuous times are be wary of discourses where God is used to justify the status quo, to justify our bigger, better versions of our own values. And try to recover what's called the prophetic tradition. The prophetic tradition being that no that breaks into all of our yeses. that cannonball that smashes into all of our systems. Not so that we are destroyed, but so that new possibilities open up, new horizons become possible, new futures become real things that we can work towards. Okay. Let's have a little look at what you've been saying. Lots of hellos. Hello, hello, hello. Let's see. I'm just scrolling. Let's see. Okay, Bryce. I know Bryce. If morality exists within the... Okay, you're going to ask a technical question, but let's go. If morality exists within a symbolic register, so what Bryce is saying is, you know, our morality, who he thinks, you know, pure, impure, good, bad, right, wrong, is, you know, at the symbolic level. It would naturally follow that it doesn't exist in the real. No. Question mark. What are the implications of this on the validity of moral relativism or a strict fundamentalism? So, okay, so if in a sense the real breaks open our moral categories, our moral frameworks, yeah, Bryce is asking, you know, what are the implications for this? Does that mean we're all moral relativists? You know, and is the only alternative to that fundamentalism? Like very briefly, Bryce, thanks for the question. This is where I'm really interested in something Tillich said, where he goes that, so, somebody said this to me recently at a talk I did. They said there's a lot of churches where you go like, we can be open about these questions and these things, but there are certain doctrines and dogmas that you need to be, you know, hold tightly, right? And if you're in a very conservative church, there might be 10% that you can question, 90% you have to hold tightly. Or if you're in a really liberal church, it might be 90% you can be open to and 10% you hold tightly. And you can conceive of a community that goes 99% you can question and 1% you have to hold tightly to, otherwise you're just a relativist, right? Well, Tillich says no. He says simultaneously you 100% have everything open, but there is an absolute that lies within that. There's my hand analogy for Tillich, right? that will one day be in a book. And what he means by this is, if Levinas says the same, he says, the absolute is that the other says, do not murder me. When you treat a subject, a person, as an object to use and abuse, you are, by definition, reducing them from being a complex subject to a mere thing, right? So Tillich says the moral absolute is that the other must be treated as a subject. So when you meet another, you need to treat them as infinitely valuable subject, right? So that's the absolute. However, how you do that is, sadly, you have to take responsibility for yourself. Like, there is no tradition that will 100% tell you what the right thing to do is. Now, there are traditions that are, they help us make moral decisions. There's lots of ways that we can do that. But whenever we go to see like we read our horoscopes or see a psychic or whatever, often that is our attempt to not take responsibility for our actions. We want someone else to tell us. It's a kind of weird form of hypnosis. We want another to kind of get into our head and help us tell us exactly what to do. And that's running away from what Sartre called our condemnation to freedom, that we have to take responsibility for our actions. So when you read Tillich, you go, well, so the real rupture is our moral framework, but it doesn't rupture the idea that the other is a subject that we have to love completely and absolutely. So church then becomes a place where you enter in, and you might be Republican or Democrat or whatever, right? But in that place, you cultivate a sensitivity to the unique subjectivity of the other. And then when you leave that place, of course you need political and religious views, and you fight that out. But you fight it out sharing in common the idea that the other has singular value. That does not mean that you will politically agree on what the solutions are. You have to fight that out, make your case, and if you're lucky or unlucky enough, what you say will get done, and then you have to take responsibility for whether that worked or whether that was a disaster. You can't put it onto something else. But what you agree on is we are fighting to make the world a more beautiful place for life and subjectivity. So that's what I would say to that, if that makes sense, Bryce. Let's see, let's go. Melissa. Yeah, let's see, what did you say? Melissa, oh yeah, I'm sorry, you're having a conversation with Bryce, so I'll jump in and see if what you're saying here is something I can contribute to as well. I see, Mr. Bryce, I have very different ideas where the symbolic and the imaginary are real planes that we just can't observe physically with our eyes. Oh, you're talking to Bryce. Things that we observe and explore through our minds or hearts, the mind being on a different plane than the heart dimension, if you will. Okay, I'd need to go back and look at what else you were saying, but glad you guys are chatting. Oh yeah, Seth says, can you tie this into A/theism? So I've used this term, which I've kind of borrowed from people like Derrida and Caputo, where you write atheism with a slash between the A and the T. So there's this kind of move between theism and atheism. And yet you can say basically that theism involves certain beliefs about there being a God and what type of God that is, right? Every theism has an atheism. A philosopher, Jean-Luc Marion, is very good on this. He says that there's no such thing as like, in the same way there's, if you say I'm a theist, you go, well, what God do you believe in? Atheism also is regional. If someone's an atheist, you say, what God do you not believe in? Because atheism is always the rejection of a theism, right? There's a certain view of God and there's a certain rejection of God. So theism and atheism are intertwined in this way. So when I write, so theism is often like the structural thing. It's our beliefs, our ideas, and then atheism is the critique of that. And what I argue in some of my books, and start arguing in How Not to Speak of God, is that the Christian, in a sense, is an A/theist, because the symbolic and the imaginary kind of operate in the theism side, and the real operates on the atheism side. And this clash is where the most interesting stuff happens, basically in the slash between theism and atheism. This is why in so many ways I have been critiquing the divide between atheism and theism. That's why Atheism for Lent explores the complex and beautiful love affair, tumultuous love affair that has really existed between atheism and theism that you don't see on a popular level. This is one of the most beautiful love stories you'll ever read. It's got violence and affairs and passion and like any crazy relationship where one moment they're shouting at each other and the next moment they're in a passionate embrace. That's the relationship between atheism and theism. And I believe that is the space that we need to live, that Christianity lives. Just in the way that I said that human beings live in the space between the lived life and the unlived life, there is a sense in which we live in the space between theism and atheism. And the real is what allows us to do that. Oh, hey, Kathleen. Hey, Pete. Would you say the dialectic view equals apophatic? Apophaticism is definitely a form of dialectic theology. There's a few different forms. So it's kind of like the Venn diagrams. All apophatic theology is dialectic, but not all dialectic theology is apophatic. Now, if I thought about that, I might disagree with myself. There might be a form of apophatic theology that's not, but apophatic theology usually, says, this is who we think God is, and God is bigger, better, different than that. So there is the yes and the no, and these exist in this tumultuous relationship that ultimately gives birth to a third, which dialectic theology always has a third, which is a different way of being that's beyond the opposites. I'll just maybe do one more because I don't want to bore you too much. Mind you can stop and then come back. You can do a toilet break, whatever you need to do. Okay, yeah, I'll finish with Brent Robbins, who asks, where does the liturgical element of religion fit into this theoretical framework? I love this is what I love. This is what I'm into. I believe in liturgy, which means I believe in kind of that we need to have rituals that in a sense draw us into the things that we're talking about here. We all have rituals. We go to hear musicians, comedians, storytellers. We create rituals in our family lives. The issue is, can you create a set of rituals that bring in the real? So there's two types. Let's be simple about it. You got a liturgy. Every week you go to church and you sing certain songs, maybe take communion, I don't know, whatever you do, right? Does that, at its worst, you can engage weekly in a community that solidifies the symbolic and the imaginary. It keeps giving you God as a bigger, better, more flattering version than yourself, and as the structure that guarantees that you're right, that God thinks the way you think, or of course it's said as in God, you think the way God thinks. And so all the rituals are designed, or most of the rituals are designed to solidify God as the symbolic and the imaginary. That's deeply problematic. But you can create a liturgical structure that involves God coming in as the projectile, breaking up the symbolic and the imaginary. This is what I did with decentering practices. Every decentering practice I set up, and there's 4 of them, and the evangelism project, I'll just talk about that for a second, was a liturgical practice designed to help us encounter the other so that we will be ruptured. So we go to a community to be evangelized by them. And as most of you will know if you followed my work, the idea is not that you go to the Islamic Society and go, right, well, convert us to Islam. You hear what they believe and you might be persuaded, you might not, but that's not where the evangelism happens. It's at the point when you say, what is it like to be a Muslim in Belfast? And what is it like to encounter the Christian community that I'm a part of? And then you see yourself through their eyes and you begin to your view ruptures, you realize that maybe that you're part of a system that creates pollution, that your way of looking at the world is actually doing violence to the other. And so the evangelism happens because your symbolic world is ruptured through an encounter with the other. So that means creating liturgical structures where the say, for example, the other, whoever the other is heard, is given platform and given voice. It can be systems in which prayers and sermons and music that actually engages in doubt, complexity, unknowing, brings in the mystical, all of that. So that's what I'm trying, like basically what I argue is that sadly so much of the actual existing church operates at a liturgical level which solidifies the symbolic and the imaginary, even if the individuals don't even believe that. Liberal churches that don't think God is just a bigger version of ourselves often still sing songs that solidify those very things. A radical theology creates a radical liturgy that embraces doubt, ambiguity, complexity, the voice of the other, that ruptures and breaks open new possibilities. And the reason why I believe that it's good to have a space for us doing that is because otherwise we just hang out with people who are like us. Not all of us, but we tend to. We tend to only surround ourselves with the people who are the same age as us or who think broadly the same as us. We curate our Facebook page so it's only people who, echo our own views, and we unfriend or silence people who are different from us. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes, whatever. But what I'm saying is that if we don't have an oasis in the desert, a space of quietness in our lives where we encounter others, where we're sensitized to the subjectivity and the infinite value of the other, then we can become one-dimensional very, very quickly. So I believe that it's really good to have a space, but that might not be obviously church on a Sunday, but spaces in our week that we are sensitized into listening to the other and into self-critique. All right, so thank you very much. I'm glad you were able to join the multiple me's for this Facebook Live. I'll try and check in the next couple of days. So take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.